everybody. You are attending the webinar hosted by Charlene Margot. I will introduce her. Just to make sure that you are in the right Zoom room, you have chosen talking with your students about race and to hear several panelists give perspectives and ideas to help you do that, talk with your students about race. And so as attendees, you are muted. You have access to both the chat feature and the Q&A feature. And Bev, who is our chat manager and Q&A, will feed questions to the panel. Please help me welcome our panelist host, Charlene Margot. I've known Charlene for 9 years. Charlene is a Palo Alto native and a lifelong advocate of children, schools, and families and educators. She is the founder and CEO of the Parent Education Series and new nonprofit, The Parent Venture, leading providers of professional, high-quality parent and community education like the one you'll experience today. Charlene holds a BA in psychology from Stanford, go Cardinal, and a master's in education from San Jose State University, go Spartans. Thank you, Charlene, for hosting.
Thank you so much, Diane. It is really a pleasure to be here today with all of you. We could not be more excited. As Diane mentioned, my partner, Bev Hartman, and I are both longtime educators, so our hearts are always in the classroom with you. So we hope today will be both educational and informative, and also joyful. You know, in many ways, this is a really exciting week with the announcement of Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's running mate. So again, we hope that that will add a little sparkle to our conversation today. This event, this professional development session, was actually inspired by a parent education event that we did this last July called Talking to Your Kids About Race, which was in itself inspired by Kareem Graham's article that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle as an op-ed, White Parents Talk to Your Kids About Race. So we were introduced to Kareem through a counselor at Menlo Atherton High School. And then I invited Julie Lythcott-Haims, who is well known for her work in this space, and Dr. Donald Grant from Pacific Oaks. So before I tell you a little bit more about our presenters, I just wanted to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing format-wise. So first of all, many thanks to Diane Burbank, both for your partnership and for your support of parent education. It means a great deal to parents in the district to know that your administrators support parent and community education. Secondly, I want to thank Victoria Dye, the Director of Professional Development for the Sequoia Union High School District, that our event caught her eye and that we are here today. So we're going to have about an hour's worth of time for our panelists to respond to questions that I will pose to them, some that we formatted, some that have come in for educators. And then the last 30 minutes or so will be questions from you, our attendees. So as Diane mentioned, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions. We will respond to as many of those as we can get to today. And thank you to those of you who submitted questions via a Google form. Those are also going to be included. Okay, let's get going. Julie Lythcott-Haims is a former Dean of Freshmen at Stanford University. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling anti-helicopter parenting manifesto, How to Raise an Adult, the award-winning memoir, Real American, on being Black and biracial in white spaces, and the forthcoming book, Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. Julie is actively working on the last 2 chapters of that book as we speak. All right. Dr. Donald Grant is Executive Director of the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena, California. He began his career as a middle school science teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, and he holds a BA in biology and a doctorate in clinical psychology. Donald is an international speaker and workshop facilitator, film and TV consultant, and author. His latest book, Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, was published in 2019. You will also see in the chat that Donald is making that book available as a free PDF, so please do check that out. And finally, last but not least, Karim Graham was raised in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. He earned a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Rice University and completed his PhD and postdoctoral training in immunology at Stanford University. He was an assistant professor in the School of Medicine at Emory University, and he currently works as a drug discovery scientist in the biotech sector. Kareem lives in Burlingame with his wife and 2 children, ages 9 and 13. So welcome, Julie, Donald, and Kareem. Thank you so much for being with us today. So I'd like to do what we did last time, which is start off by having each of you give us just a little bit about yourself and why you felt it was important to join this conversation today on talking to educators, administration, faculty, staff members about race and racism. Julie, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thank you so much, Charlene and Diane, and to my fellow panelists, Kareem and Donald. I'm very excited to get to be here with you. Thank you, Bev. Thank you to all of you who are deciding to make us a part of your morning. As a 52-year-old Black and biracial woman in America, I am delighted that the nation's heart and mind seems to be turning once again in a very significant way, as has happened in the past, seems now to be turning its attention, its care toward race. I have a lived experience that I will be sharing with you today as I answer questions. I have written a book about my lived experience of being Black and biracial in white spaces. A lot of non-Black people are finally waking up to the fact that we live a different experience in these United States. And even as I say that, I am aware that my light skin and my socioeconomic class and my gender and my parents' educational status has afforded me a degree of privilege that many Black people in America do not enjoy. So to whatever extent I have struggled, I'm aware that my own struggles are minimal compared to those of others. So this is one of the most pressing issues of our time. I think systemic racism, climate change, and socioeconomic inequality feel to me to be, maybe the 3 most pressing issues in our culture, in our community, aside from COVID. So I'm delighted to be here and excited to dive into these great questions.
Thank you, Julie. Kareem, why don't you give us your impressions on that question?
Well, I just want to say hello to everyone. Thank you for being with us in this virtual space, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Good to see you again. It's really a pleasure to be here. I view this, as Julie said, this is one of the pressing issues of our time. And I think really what we all hope for, or what I hope we would want, is a world where everyone can achieve their full potential. And racism, unfortunately, is robbing people of color of that opportunity. And so I'm so glad that we're here having these conversations, and hopefully, my motivation, is to, just sort of share my perspective, but also to learn. I want to learn from the educators that are part of this discussion today, somewhat selfishly, because I have school-age children myself, and so I want to learn how to best support my children as they go through the educational system. I grew up in Oklahoma City primarily, experiencing frequent blatant racism, but there was also many other things that I wasn't able to fully process at the time because I didn't have the language or the vocabulary. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I heard the terms, microaggression or unconscious bias, and so I think, what I spent a lot of my adult life doing is, revisiting some of those earlier incidents, viewing them through a new lens and seeing them for what they really were. And my hope is to, empower and embolden my own children to move through this world with a degree of self-confidence and pride.
Thank you, Kareem. And again, I want to remind our viewers that the links to Julie's book and her website and the article the op-ed that Kareem wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle are in chat. So please do check out that chat button for some of these important links. Also, I wanted to mention that we did have a fourth panelist, Eric Abrams from Stanford's Graduate School of Education. He's their Chief Inclusion Officer. I'm sorry, Eric could not make it today. He had a family emergency. So again, just wanted to note that. Donald, what can you tell us about yourself and why you felt it was important today to have this conversation with and for educators?
Well, thank you for being here. And again, a pleasure to be with my fellow panelists again. It's important on several fronts. I'm a dad as well. I have a school-age son. My son is a 11-year-old sixth grader at a small private school, and my wife and I are one of the only monoracial Black families at the school. And when I look at the diversity work and the implementation of anti-bias work that we've done at that school, and I sit on the board of trustees, I'm the chair of governance on the board of trustees at his school, and I just see so many opportunities for children to not be injured. And I feel like these conversations are all aimed at reducing childhood injuries and the way that teachers can engage if they are willing and able and are under a leadership that provides these types of spaces. And so I feel that it's so valuable to have these opportunities, and I'd like to contribute as much as I can to ensure that people can ask the questions and get the clarity and make the errors that they need to make in a less impactful space like this, so that when they are in the classroom or they are with the parent, they minimize their opportunities to provide injuries to those families by really doing it here. And so that's really the reason why I'm really enjoying the spaces that you're curating for educators.
Thank you so much, Donald. And you know that it reminds me of the comment that Diane made before we started this webinar, and Donald as well, that, you know, we know as teachers that we can't get things right. Kids learn by making mistakes. So we don't expect your conversations with your students to be perfect. We do expect you to try. And so really today, we're just having the conversation to help you open some of these, respond to kids. You know your students best, just like we say to parents, you know your child best. So again, the important thing is we're having that talk, but I do want people to not be afraid and to be willing to make mistakes. So the first question is really fundamental, really foundational, and that is, what is the role of the teacher in talking with students about race and racism? In your perception, from your perspective, what is the role of the teacher? Donald, you're an educator. Let's have you start that one.
Sure. I think it's one of the most critical roles. We know that individuals are not oftentimes equipped to have different conversations. I'm doing a lot of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice consultation work across the country right now. And, you know, in the same way that I talk to CEOs and COOs, it's the same thing with teachers, and helping them understand that it's critical because they're a touch point whereby in most of our households, there is a very homogeneous sense of self, meaning that most people in our house look similarly to us. However, when we're in a work environment or a classroom environment, it becomes suddenly very heterogeneous, and we don't always have the language and the tools to manage that. And so when we talk about teachers and business leaders, it's critical that they're having these conversations because they're in the spaces where all of the magic surrounding diversity happens, whether it's the magic that is the magic that hurts people or the magic that creates a great synergy where a little kid sees themselves in literature for the first time because you've chosen to decolonize your bookshelf in your classroom or your library in your school. And so teachers are very, very perfectly situated and positioned to advance these discussions because it's kind of like an in vivo experiment. Everybody is there for you to be able to advance the conversation. As a dad, when I have conversations about diversity and racism, everybody in my house is Black. And so there are not a lot of opportunities to provide these different messages in ways that teachers can do it in the classroom. And it doesn't have to be explicit. It could be something small like the way you curate groups in a classroom where you might deliberately make sure that it is a mixed group, because that concept called jigsawing, that's one of the major ways in which research has demonstrated that we reduce prejudice by having people engage in an activity together where everybody has a role in that activity to the success of the outcome. And that if you have children of difference doing that, different learning abilities, learning styles, genders, all those things, you really provide a foundational opportunity for children to see the value in other people as they all work together towards a collective goal. And so there's so many things that teachers can do, and the positioning of this work, particularly with a lot of schools adopting socio-emotional learning curriculums and paradigms, the anti-bias curriculum juxtaposes very nicely to social-emotional learning curriculum, and they shouldn't be siloed. They should be brought together to talk about that. And I will say really quickly, Charlene, is that it's important to note that people minimize the age at which children begin to learn about, understand race, but research demonstrates at the age of 4, children begin to behave differently, engage in different activities, and treat other children differently based on the phenotypic components of race. I will find the book in a bit, but The First R of Racism is a case study that talks about how children learn about race, and at the age of 4 in preschool, they begin to operationalize that. And so it's critical that we have these conversations because they're getting messages about it already.
Thank you, Donald. Really excellent insight. I had not heard that term jigsawing. That's a really good one. Kareem, you know, in your article, you mentioned that it's not enough for people to say that they're colorblind. It's not enough in a classroom and it's not enough in a family. Would you speak to that? I know that as a father, you are very engaged in your children's education. What do you see as a parent as the role of the teacher in talking with students about race?
Well, yeah, I think I really want to just underscore what Dr. Grant said about having intentionality behind how the classroom is structured and the way lessons are delivered. I think that's quite key. I think teachers have a fundamental role, and it doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of, you know, brilliant performative oratory. You know, it can be intentionality behind the way assignments are thought out and planned, so that you're not necessarily highlighting disparities or inequalities amongst students in your classroom. You know, I think when I talked in the piece about how it's not enough to be kind, I mean, it's not to dismiss how important kindness is. I mean, of course, we want our children to be kind, and I'd like to believe that I'm a kind person myself, but you know, the limitation of kindness is that it ignores the way that race and racism influences outcomes and behaviors in our day-to-day life and experience. And, you know, as Dr. Grant was saying, you know, at a very early age, children are starting to form these notions and treat each other differently based on you know, kind of notions of race, even if it's not clear that they have the vocabulary, they're at least developing these notions. And so, I mean, I think, you know, to borrow from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, you know, we have to be intentional and proactive if we want to combat racism in our society within systems. It's not enough to just, you know, sit back and, you know, be a passive bystander. If we want to root out this problem, we have to be proactive. And you know, like I said, kindness is a noble thing, but it should not be the end goal, because it's not enough.
I like that, intentionality and proactivism. So, Julie, you know, in your writings and in your work and in your voice, you both talk about parenting and race and your experience as a biracial and Black woman. How do you see this, the role of the teacher in education, or the role of the educator, essentially?
I tell parents that we're our kids' biggest role models, but whether we are their best role models is all about how we behave. I think teachers are right there next to parents as the next biggest role models, and at different times of a child's life, maybe even the biggest role model. This is why you got into teaching, right? This is why you became an educator. You want to make a difference in the lives of children. And what this conversation is about is that there are many children, Black children, brown children, who don't feel they matter in the classroom and are in fact sometimes explicitly made to feel they don't matter. So the role of the teacher is foundational and critical in the lives of children, obviously. When I was a dean at Stanford, as the Dean of Freshmen, my philosophy was we need to create a culture of belonging, because when humans feel they belong in an environment, then they feel permission to ask for help and also to shoot for their wildest dreams. You know, everything between I'm struggling to, you know, I'm acing it, what more is there, right? They need to feel belonging, to feel a vested interest in the right to take advantage of everything that's offered. So the same is true, I feel, for K through 12 environments. So how does a kid feel a sense of belonging? When the teacher signals with eyes and facial gestures and bodily attention and linguistic attention that I see you, you matter to me, your learning is my pursuit. You know, every child needs to see that this teacher is interested in me, as opposed to dismissing me, mad at me, doesn't like people like me, right? So the way the teacher shows up in every interaction either signals, I'm interested, I care about all of you, or doesn't. My theory of change is at the individual level. Our individual hearts and minds can be changed to shape our behavior in a way that treats people equally or doesn't. So I just think it's so critical in this moment that teachers be brave enough to examine within themselves, am I really treating every student joyfully, equally, regardless of their background?
I love that, joyfully, equally. Charlene, if I can just jump in for a second to piggyback on that, just really quickly. When children feel seen and heard, it's really important. For years, we were working from this paradigm of tolerance. We want people to build tolerance. And that kind of, like colorblind we talked about earlier, colorblind is bad, tolerance is bad. I don't want you to tolerate me.
Right.
Children need to be welcomed. And as Julie, that's what inspired me to piggyback off of Julie's, because she's describing a paradigm that just doesn't say, I see you and I'm going to give you assignments. It shows that I value you. And so when teachers have explicit and implicit biases around socioeconomic status, around, sexual orientation, around race and gender, they don't know that they're operationalizing the exact opposite of what they want to do until they deal with that. And so when Julie says these things happen on an individual level, it's critical that teachers specifically understand how their biases operationalize themselves. So when a teacher is colorblind, that means that they don't understand that when their kid goes into Target after school with their buddies and there's one Black kid, that Black kid's mother or father has taught them, you always get a receipt, you always get a bag, because they're being looked at differently. And if a teacher is colorblind, they don't realize that that entire after school experience is something different. Is something different. And so we want teachers to be able to see the boundaries and the lack of boundaries that they can create for kids. And they have to open themselves up to becoming anti-racist and becoming anti-sexist and becoming, outwardly present against models of oppression. Even if you decide personally you don't agree with lifestyles of LGBTQIA people, if you don't make a deliberate decision to do that, that seventh grader in your classroom who is tussling with those ideas, your homophobia is oozing out of your ears and your eyes and your nose, and you don't know that you are just really ruining this child. And so you really want to pay attention to that. If you have racist ideas and thoughts, it's hard to deal with internally, but you have to. You're not a barista at Starbucks. If the barista at Starbucks is racist or homophobic, individuals are not injured at a high level. They're microaggressions, but you all have bigger power than that.
Well said, Donald. You know, I think my favorite photograph this week was Kamala Harris with her second grade teacher, who was herself a Black woman. And she said that that teacher really made her feel seen. And I think about even Oprah Winfrey brings her first grade teacher on stage to say, you know, that was the first time that an educator said to me, you matter, I see you, and I know who you can become. And that those teachers changed the lives of those women in a really positive way. So I think this is a good time to ask this next question. I wrote this one, so I hope you guys enjoy it. Can you think of a time or an example when an educator made a difference in your personal experience with race or racism? Anybody?
I'm going to jump here if I can. 3 people instantly come to mind. One is a Black woman. I moved around a lot as a kid. I now live in Palo Alto. I raised my 2 kids here. They went to gun. I'm a proud gun mom. But I grew up in the Midwest and the East Coast. My parents moved a lot. I had my first Black teacher when I was in the 3rd grade, Mrs. Bernard. She drilled us on our multiplication tables, and I was just wanting to please her so badly. I realize now I wanted to please her so badly because she was a Black teacher, and I wanted to show up for her and do what she expected me to do. And so props to Mrs. Bernard at Aldo Leopold School in Madison, Wisconsin. But the two, there are 2 ends of the spectrum here, of very positive and very negative, both white men. In the 5th grade, my best friend was put in, it's mostly white school, best friend was put in gifted and talented. I was not. I knew she was smart. I knew she was not smarter than me. Pretty sure about that. Went home, told my mother. My mom's like, okay, let's go. She came and talked to my teacher. The teacher was not persuaded that I should be tested. My mother escalated to the principal, insisting. So they brought in someone from the district, gave me the IQ test, mailed the results to our house, which I peeked at. I was put in the gifted group. And so now I'm getting to do the cool projects and puzzles in the gifted and talented group. And my 5th grade teacher stands up in front of our entire class and says, apparently all it takes to be gifted is for your parent to meet with the principal. And I am 52 years old, and I will never forgive that man for what he tried to do and succeeded for decades in doing to me, which I am finally over, okay? He said that. My score was 99th percentile, sir, okay? I didn't have the wherewithal to say that as a 5th grader, but I had seen the letter, okay? On the positive side, I had a professor at Stanford my freshman year after I had gotten a B, a C, and a D first quarter and thought, oh, of course, I'm Black. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to succeed here. Stereotype threat, heaping on me, making me feel like I didn't deserve to be there. This was a white professor, Jim Steyer, teaching a civil rights class in the spring that I took because I was encouraged to take classes that I loved because I'd be motivated to push hard and do the hard work. He could see one day when he asked a really hard question and 200 kids were silent. He could see in my facial gestures that I knew I wanted to say something, but I was afraid to speak because I didn't want to be Black and wrong, okay? Because we carry the weight of the race on our shoulders, right? I didn't want to speak up, but I wanted to speak up because I knew I had a thoughtful response to his difficult question. He saw what was happening inside me, and he looked at me and he raised his eyebrows like, you want to say something, kid? And I was like, well, and he just nodded at me, and with his body language, I'm getting emotional because as I responded, he showed me and everyone else in the class with his body language that Julie Lythcott was worth listening to. He egged me on. He brought the courage out of me because of how he responded, because he called on me, and because he lovingly, thoughtfully worked with me as I articulated my ideas, which, by the way, at that point, everyone in the classroom was writing down because the teacher was signaling, Julie is saying good stuff.
Oh, Julie, those are great. Those are great stories. I think about Michelle Obama, who will never forget the counselor who said to her, I don't think you're Princeton material. And when she got to the White House, she was pretty sure that that woman was not going to get an invitation to dinner. Kareem, do you have a memory that you'd like to share?
Yeah, there are quite a few, and unfortunately, I think there are many examples that are negative in my upbringing and educational path. But focusing on the positive for a minute, one of my first mentors in science, I was an undergraduate at Bryce University, and my first experience working in a laboratory, I was trying to get some laboratory experience because at that time I wanted to go to medical school, and people said that's what you had to do. You had to work in a lab. I was partnered with a postdoctoral scholar at the time who happened to be African American. He just really took an interest in me, a really intense interest in me, and really, spent extra time with me, teaching me things. I really appreciated his approach to science, and it had, not an insignificant impact on my decision to then go on to grad school and enter, the STEM field. And so I think, having role models is so important. And I can think back to, even as far as second grade, I had a teacher, a white lady. This was her first year teaching, and but it was very clear to me that she felt that I had talent, and that I had an ability to excel, and she pushed me and encouraged me, which was needed, because in every other facet of life, every other corner, I was getting pushback, being told that I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough. And so, those are two, I think, prime examples. And I think, along the way, I felt like I came into contact with people who just gave me just a bit of a nudge, just said, hey, I think you have a good idea here. If you explore it further, it could really turn into something, or hey, this is a good start, but I know you can do better, So, that kind of feedback is just as important, and made me feel like, well, this person cares about me and wants to see me become the best that I can be.
Those are wonderful stories, Kareem. I think that knowing that a teacher really sees you and appreciates your abilities can take you a long way. You remember that from the first grade, and it impacted your career. So that's some powerful storytelling. Donald, my guess is you have an example for us of an educator that influenced you.
I do. And, I do want to pay homage to Julie's story and the passion and the energy surrounding it. I just feel, I felt as she was speaking, I felt like I was emoting myself. And so, I want to highlight just a couple of pieces of that just very briefly before I share my story, just to demonstrate how Julie made intentions to tell her age, which most of us don't do, to demonstrate the length of injury that can sustain itself across time. Notice, she said she's gotten over it, but it took decades. But even when you get over something, and I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, by the way, I don't practice and I'm not licensed, but even when you get over something, it still impacts, informs, and in some ways dictates how you move through the world. And so even if a child recovers from your injury, it doesn't mean that the injury is still not sustained. It's kind of like when you get surgery. I had a snowboarding accident a few years ago, and the shoulder surgery worked fine, but there's still the scar there, and I can see it. And even if I don't feel pain anymore, I see that scar and think about the injury, even if it doesn't hurt. And so I want to really highlight that piece. I also want to explain a little bit about stereotype threat that Julie mentioned, just in case people need some more clarification on what that means. Stereotype threat is a construct that was studied that demonstrates that if you have a stereotype that exists about yourself, it increases the likelihood that you will fulfill that stereotype, and as a result, perform poorly. They did some of the studies on white men and innate athletic ability. And even if you've seen the movie White Men Can't Jump, you know there's a stereotype that exists about white men and innate athletic ability. And what they did was they gave two different groups of men the exact same test, but on one hand called it a test of problem solving, and on another hand called it a test of innate athletic ability. And because the valence of athletic ability set above as the men attempted those tasks, they performed more poorly under that valence than they did under problem solving. And so they did the test with women in science and math. They did the test with Black people and academic performance, because all those are stereotypes, and that valence sits there. I'd encourage you guys to read up on Imposter Syndrome, because that's kind of the next step that feeds into Stereotype Threat that's important to note. I actually had a really great experiences throughout my entire academic career. And I'm going to say something that's going to appear a little bit controversial. A lot of that was due to segregation. Not that I'm old enough where I went to segregated schools. I know some of you are looking, wow, Black really doesn't crack, but that's not the case. I'm saying that I grew up in neighborhoods in Buffalo, New York that were primarily African-American. And I, from K through 4th grade, had a school that was primarily all Black teachers. And they were providing just all of the love, care, and support that a little Black boy who was not really resourced needed. And then I was bused to a magnet honor school where the thinking was so progressive that, of course, there was racism and microaggressions because there weren't a whole lot of Black people. But City Honors did a good job whereby my sophomore English teacher was bringing in literature from August Wilson, and we were working on those things in school. And that leads me to the final thought on that, is that I did have lots of conversations with school administrators from the South when they were part of integrating schools. Now, we know that right now in our school systems, due to socioeconomics, we are resegregated in a way that we don't necessarily pay attention to and we don't call it out. But what I will say is, speaking with these women who were largely in their 80s and 90s at the time I was having these conversations, they demonstrated a clear switch when Black children were bused to schools where white teachers still harbored racism, and what that did. People thought that it was just all beneficial because they were getting the new textbooks, they were getting the better facilities, all those things. But what we lost in those moments were the opportunities that I remember very clearly having, leadership opportunities where in 2nd and 3rd grade, Donald, you do this speech, you do that, because everybody primarily was Black or brown in my school, including teachers, including Mrs. Woods, the principal, who I still remember her name today. And so when you think about school integration, you have to think about the fact that in the 60s, we took a whole cohort of children and placed them inside classrooms with racist teachers. Am I saying all of them were racist? No. But in the 60s, while schools were segregated, it was a high probability that if you were white, you harbored racism. What we're not paying attention to now is the fact that cognitive dissonance doesn't allow us to understand the fact that if we are not anti-racist, we are racist. And I'll say that again because it's challenging for people to accommodate that, right? In the same way that if I am not anti-sexist, I am sexist. If I am not actively working to dismantle the systems of sexism that disenfranchise my wife, my mother, my aunts, and my cousins, I'm participating in the privilege associated with it. And so what I'm encouraging you all to do is really pay attention to how you engage, because you may in fact be promoting white supremacist policies that you have no idea that you're doing by not actively fighting against them. Equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is giving people what they need. The little Black and brown children in your classroom deserve equity, not equality. So yes, it is going to require you to do a couple of extra things in your lesson plan. Yes, it is going to require you to find books about Black children written by Black people. That means first voice literature, right? We're looking for that to happen. We had to pull a book out of my son's classroom because it was one of the I Am series books, and it was about Harriet Tubman. And there was just one small paragraph in the book that talked about how wonderful of a childhood she had. As a Black dad, do I know that a person who was enslaved may have smiled or told a joke one time? Of course I do. But to demonstrate that this woman who was enslaved had a happy childhood, that's a colonized version of that story. Could they have talked about her having a birthday party and she was excited about that? Certainly. But to say that any enslaved person had a happy childhood is revisionist history and an effort to minimize the dangers and the shame and guilt associated with white supremacy.
Well, thank you, Donald. Really well said. There's a question that has come in that's related to that I'm going to get to in just a minute. But you're mentioning how important it was for you as a young Black child to have Black teachers reminds me that I want to point out that the research is pretty strong in showing that children actually learn better from teachers of color, whether they are Black or brown or white.
Yes, Charlene, and it's unambiguous research. The state of North Carolina did an assessment on all of their students in the district, and they found that for students if they had a Black teacher between 2nd and 5th grade, the students who were specifically Black had higher college aspirations when they got into high school and higher college admission rates. It's unequivocally clear.
So, Donald, you would say that that research would be powerful whether that teacher was Latinx or Black or...
I think so, Charlene. Even though their sample size was specifically looking at Black teachers, I do think you could generalize it to teachers of color. In general, I don't know what that data set would look like, and I know this was specifically for Black teachers, but we have to talk about it, specifically men. Specifically men, male teachers, is what some of the highest data was talking about. And we know there's this thing at 4th grade where children begin to disidentify, boys, Black and brown boys, begin to disidentify with academia because of the injuries associated with it. And to have men of color in classrooms, we got to do it. We got to go to schools of education, colleges, to help them understand the importance of recruiting men of color into schools of education to fill this pipeline to help the kids.
All right, thank you. So we've been talking about intentionality, and this is a question that came in from one of our audience, Kara, and I think it's a really, really good question. How explicit should a teacher be about their intentionality in heterogeneous groups with their students? How explicit should a teacher be? Anybody?
Very. In heterogeneous groups, 100%. If you have a room, and I'm assuming that the question is just based on geography, is if I have a room full of white students, should I be deliberate in saying we are developing an anti-bias curriculum and working to dismantle systems of racism through our curriculum and pedagogy? Yes, you should be explicit. You should say it. They will go home and tell their parents. You'll get phone calls. They'll call the principal. So Principal Burbank, be prepared. Bring it on. I love it. There will be consequences to doing it. Yet you have, like Julie said, how do you show up as a grown-up? You have to be prepared to take the consequences of taking that stand. And you have to be firm in your knowledge, firm in your ability, firm in your discussion points, because you're gonna have to move, you're gonna have to advance it, and you have to be deliberate about it. Kids are looking for it. Kids are looking for this leadership, guys. They're looking for you to say, we're gonna be anti-sexist, we're gonna be anti-racist, we're gonna be anti-homophobic. They're looking for it.
All right, so this is a related question, and again, I'm welcoming perspectives from anyone on the panel here. How do you call out white supremacy when you see it in a class without backlash or defensiveness from our white students? How do you call out white supremacy?
I mean, I'll jump in. I would say that you have to call it out, and I think you can't be afraid of the backlash, because there's going to be backlash no matter what. But I think, you know, just talking to it directly, calling it out for what it is, and I do think that, you know, you can soften the blow a little bit if you try to get to someone's, you know, intentions. I mean, I think, you know, impact is more important than intentions, but sometimes it can be helpful to try to understand where someone is coming from, what they might have meant or what they thought they meant. And then you might also be able to tie it to your own experience. You could say, well, I used to believe that, you know, or I used to think that way, but now I you know, I've learned and I've grown, and so now I know better. But I think it's important to address these things when they happen, or as soon as possible, rather than letting them linger and fester, because, you know, the kids of color, they're taking all of that in, and it's causing damage to them that's going to be difficult to repair.
And that's what we don't often ask about, Kareem. We ask about what happens when white kids get injured when we correct white supremacy, but we never talk about how Black and brown kids are injured when white supremacy is spewed across the classroom or in the textbook. And so I think it's really important to note that the injuries associated with the correction are much smaller than the injuries associated with the racist act or behavior.
I'm going to offer something here, which is a slight twist. It might seem orthogonal, but I think it is related. Just as we have created the term microaggressions to refer to the smaller things, which in the aggregate can really kind of amount to a tremendous injury, we distinguish microaggressions from racism. I think we did that to say, like, there's racism, like, you know, the KKK hanging, you know, lynching people, and the Nazis gassing the Jews. And then there's the microaggressions, the small daily things that don't seem as violent, but are still very problematic. Similarly, when we talk about white supremacy in the classroom, I think there's like, some people hear that and think like, does that mean someone's using the N-word? Somebody's advocating for harm to Black people and brown people? Yes, that is white supremacy, but white supremacy, in the same sense as microaggressions are tiny little things, white supremacy shows up in our language as English speakers, as Americans, as former colony of England. You know, white writers of fiction and nonfiction usually only call out the race of characters when the person is not white. So there's an embedded presumption on the part of white writers, which I tackle as a writer of color. I call this out when I see it. You know, I'm reading a book and it's this character did this and this person did this and this person did, and this character with skin as dark as the summer sky, you know, all of a sudden we get race when it's a person of color, right? That's an embedded white supremacy, right? Whiteness is the norm. We only have to mention race when it's one of those other races, okay? To really decolonize in the classroom is to appreciate that if you're going to talk about race, you need to talk about everybody's race. You don't say, well, we can't appreciate what it's like for somebody with braids in their hair on a humid day. Don't say we, say I. Maybe you as a white teacher have no idea what that's like, but that Black child in your classroom probably does have an idea. Don't presume whiteness is the norm. Don't presume you as a white person have had the normal experience. These are showing up with children with language that explicitly includes everybody and doesn't make assumptions about anybody is a way to undermine the tendency toward white supremacy in the classroom.
So relatedly, this is a question from an educator who's asking, when showing historic news, for example, clips from the Civil Rights Act, from the Civil Rights Movement, and the use of terms arise that are not of today, how do you discuss those terms with students? Julie was kind of alluding to this. So, you know, we've seen a lot of talk recently about the passing of John Lewis, and there were clips from many years ago when even listening to the broadcasters on the news, you think, oh my God, I can't believe they said that. Do you have any suggestions for that?
It's context. You want to just keep kids recognizing that, I mean, you know, the NAACP is still the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We don't use that language anymore, but we can certainly understand that changing the branding of that may be challenging, right? And it's not a slur like the Washington Redskins. And so understanding that language evolves over time is really important, and being able to incorporate that into the classroom. In the same way you may have to tell your grandfather that he can't say Oriental anymore, right? And they still think that that is not a term that's not okay. Language changes over time. And as we bring into the discussion all different groups of brownness, it's important to understand that when we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about even though the environment and the climate right now is focused on paying attention to anti-Black racism. And I will be clear, anti-Black racism is the most fatal racism in America. That doesn't mean that brown people are not experiencing racism. And so my son just recently read George Takei's book on They Call Us Enemy, which is a great graphic novel that teachers can bring into the classroom to have those discussions about other cultural groups who have always also been disenfranchised. One of the problems with this moment in time is that it's overemphasizing the oppression of Black people in some ways, and making it seem like white people have only aimed this racial oppression towards Black people. And what we know is that racial animus from white supremacy, it goes to Black people, Latinx people, Asian American people. And another discussion, and this is probably not the time for it, but another discussion is how white supremacy works to maintain separations between those groups in order to not create a unifying message to fight against white supremacy. And so creating this colorism that Julie alluded to a little bit earlier, where she operationalizes the fact that due to her being bicultural and biracial, she benefits from skin privilege. And what some people in our community might also refer to as hair texture privilege, which has shown to get advantages in certain places. Whereas Kareem and I, our skin tone would not purchase a skin privilege, but we certainly have academic privilege because we're Black men who get to be called doctor. And that means something to dismantle the fact that when my cousin who gets pulled over by the police, he's not treated in the same way that I am when I start to act all doctorish, which I don't know, whatever that means. And so when we look at the disparities and how we've created separation between Blacks and Latinos and Asians, it's also important that we talk about white supremacy from a more global strategy and help people understand that the KKK didn't just hate Black people, although they lynched more Black people and more Black people have died due to racism than any other group. We have to pay attention to the fact that all these groups are being deliberately manipulated by white supremacy to mystify what's happening. And we got to pay attention to it.
Thank you. Really important. We're getting some questions coming in, and I think you panelists have been touching on it, but I'll just call it out specifically. So where do brown folks fit into the conversation? That is biracial, mixed race, Latinx. Sequoia Union High School District, for those of you who don't know, is 41% Latinx, 13% Asian American, 4% multiracial, and just 2% African American. So again, I think you've been alluding to this, but let's see if you have some comments directly on that. Where do brown folks fit into the conversation?
The comment I'll make is, yes, first of all, thank you, Tom Chang, for raising this. And too often in the conversation since the murder of George Floyd, the narrative has been about Black people and white people, and forgetting that America is richly diverse with people from many other races. And look, America's got an obsession with skin color. You know, an elderly Indian man, a man from India, was visiting his American children. His children lived in America. He's visiting from India. He goes for a walk down the street and is beaten within inches of his life because somebody walking by thought he was Black. Okay. They were calling him the N-word. Now, technically, he's not the N-word. He's a man from India, but they didn't know. They just saw dark skin, and their instinct is, I hate those people. So, you know, I think the more ignorant folks are, frankly, they don't know what we are, where we're from. They just see the brown. They see a skin of brown. They see features they don't like. And you could be South Asian. You could be Pacific Islander. You could be Filipino. You could be Black. You could be from wherever. They see it. It's based on skin color. We had this thing called the one drop rule in America, going way back to slavery, that classified people on how much Black blood they had. Now, we know that's not a real thing, but that's what they called it. It was a way to say white is pure, and you have the stain of one drop of Black blood makes you Black. Okay, and we had all these classifications. Those laws are not with us anymore, but that mindset is embedded in the mindset of Americans and other people around the world as well. And so certainly people who are not Black but are people of color do experience this racism, the consequences of white supremacy, depending on what they look like.
So well said, Julie. Kareem, you had a wonderful scientific way of talking to kids about skin color. Do you want to share that with our audience?
Yeah, I think in the piece, what I talked about is just providing some language, some specific language that parents could use, with younger children in particular, and just talk about how people have different skin tones because of a chemical called melanin, and those with more melanin tend to have darker skin, but the amount of melanin in your skin says nothing about the kind of person that you are, and I think it's it's important with younger kids, but also with older kids too, to be explicit about what your values are, and don't assume that what you're modeling or what you're saying is being perceived or received in the way that you think it is. My kids have experienced microaggressions in progressive Burlingame, and I'm sure that the parents of those children would believe that they're raising their kids to be kind and open-minded. But I think you have to be very clear, asking your kids questions and making sure that your values are getting across. I'll never forget when my daughter was in kindergarten. She came home from school and she was just praising her teacher at the time. Her name was Mrs. Slagle. She said, "I'm so glad I have a teacher like Mrs. Slagle, because she told me that there are 365 days in the year, and mommy and daddy have been telling me that there are only 355 days in the year." And it really, we were taken aback, like, oh, I think we both know, my wife and I, that there are the number of days in the year, but she wasn't receiving it that way. She was interpreting something different. And so if you extrapolate that to other topics, to other things, then you could see how very quickly, if you're not checking in with your kids, they might be getting a very, very distorted view of the world, or not getting the view that you want them to have, because white supremacy is so rampant in our culture.
It's huge.
Well, I must say, I can tell that this is a group of educators because we're getting fantastic questions. Okay, here's a really important one. Do you have any advice for collaborating with and talking to colleagues that refuse to acknowledge their own biases against Black or Brown students, or are more focused on serving overserved student populations?
This is a really great book that is opening eyes and doors for lots of great people. It's written by a former blogger, and the conversation in it seems to help people move the needle. It doesn't necessarily open like, Robin DiAngelo, because the whole white privilege language really throws people off, and some people are not ready to engage at that stage. So you want to talk about race, I think, is a really valuable book as a conversation starter. I think school leadership needs to mandate book clubs. I know there's all sorts of rules on hours that people have to work and things like that. But remember, for many people, it creates a comfort zone when you're working with kids who have everything they need. Kids who feel welcome all the time. And so we really want to stretch our teachers and ask them to really engage in different ways and serve the people who need it. Remember, cognitive dissonance makes us change the truth or change our behaviors. When a teacher is forced to work with an under-resourced kid or a kid who's experiencing some sort of discrimination, it forces them to face the fact that this exists. It forces them to face the fact that they may not be doing all they can do to fight oppressive systems when they see this kid who is being marginalized as a result of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or whatever it may be. And so we have to ask teachers to think about, why is it challenging for me to approach working with this particular group? Why is it challenging for me to work with Black students? And it's oftentimes about the teacher's self-journey, the teacher's experience with shame and guilt, and their inability or unwillingness to really go in and dig into their own bias, dig into their own experience. Remember, if you look up a picture of a lynching from 1970 or 1965, there were children there. Those children are the ages of the college students currently grandparents. What that means is that the juxtaposition of really, really heavy racism, many of your great-grandmothers or grandmothers may have been out at a lynching site where their neighbor came by and said, hey, get your kids, we're gonna run down the street, chase down a black man hanging from a tree and set him on fire. The pictures, the evidence is there that there were children there. And so we have to be honest about the intergenerational trauma associated with the oppressor role and saying, this is hard for me to approach, but I gotta do it because there's this intergenerational history associated with it that white teachers have to face. Even if they think, I'm very anti-racist, I'm doing the work, that doesn't mean that your grandmother was not taken as a 10-year-old child down to watch a black man be murdered and what that means. It's really important to pay attention to things like that because white people are not always forced to confront that history of intergenerationalness. Although we always talk about immigration trauma with Latinx people coming over the border and how Abuela had to hide out in a transmission box and come over the border. We don't always talk about that. We have to start talking about that.
I want to offer one other great book in addition to Ijoma Oluo's book, which Donald just showed. So you want to talk about race. This is Debbie Irving's book. Now she's a white woman. Ijoma's a black woman, but this is called Waking Up White. And it's basically, 20, probably 50 micro chapters, 46 micro chapters of cringeworthy moments she had that she tells with such openness that readers will turn every page rooting for her and ultimately for all of us. She breaks it down to the level of this interaction at the grocery store, this interaction in the classroom, this interaction in the nonprofit I'm on the board of. Really great stories that I think will open somebody up who doesn't really see their, how they may be doing it or saying it or feeling it. These are great confessionals from a white woman. I'm told white people like it. I happen to like it too.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Donald. Great referrals. We will assemble these resources that are being suggested and make sure that they get back to the organizers of this event, okay? Because those are terrific. And I don't know, Bev, if you're going to have time to put those in the chat. But anyway, more great questions. What I'm really proud of and pleased about today is these questions are difficult. They're difficult for me to read. They're difficult probably for you to answer. But I'm really pleased that it looks like we've created a safe space. And that's actually one of the questions that I'd like to pose to you. How do you create a safe space for students in your classroom of any color? We lost Donald for the moment.
Oh no.
Well, we'll wait till he gets back for that one.
I'll offer something. I'm not an educator. I've been a college dean, never been K through 12 other than as a student. My analog here is when I'm on the speaking tour with my book, Real American, talking about race. I'm up at an elite boarding school in New England, fancy brand name school. And I do my talk and I get questions, and afterwards I'm in the book signing line. All these kids pour out and they're surrounding me and they want to talk about it. And it's largely the black and brown kids, the brown skinned Asian kids. But there are some white men lingering and they have this look on their face like, I want to say something, but I'm not sure I should say it, but they're gonna, because they feel empowered and they feel they have the right, and they do. So this white kid asked me, the black kids have a group, an affinity group, and the Latinx kids have an affinity group, and the gay kids have an affinity group. I want to create a white affinity group, and why is that bad? And I took a deep breath, and I thought, oh my God. And then I said, first of all, these other groups are created because kind of the dominant paradigm in America for quite some time has been the white folks gathering is the norm. The white way of being is the norm. So these other groups and communities have to gather up amongst themselves to feel that kind of community and solidarity that it appears white folks just feel all the time. Okay, number one. So these groups are trying to create for us what you all already have. There is nothing implicitly wrong with your gathering up. Everybody wants to be with people like them. That's human, that's natural. We just are terribly afraid based on history that when y'all gather up as a small group, you're going to act violently toward the rest of us. So I don't have any problem with you having a group of white folks who want to do what white people want to do with one another. Just don't go after the rest of us. Don't use that as an opportunity to advance white supremacy. It's fine to be proud of where your ancestors came from, but anytime it starts to become we're better than those people, we're going to take those people out, we're going to undermine them, that's the problem. And that's why it frightens us to think of y'all gathering up in your own groups, because history has taught us that that's dangerous for us. Now, I was speaking respectfully, kindly. I was listening to this kid. I was looking him in the eye. And I chose to share this example in response to this question because I think that kid felt that was a safe space for him to have that conversation. I think the kids listening heard me treat him with dignity and respect, but also be super clear about when things become problematic. You know, when are we kind of, it's all good, everyone's fine, we can all share what we want, and when does something cross a line? I was willing to call out what we all fear when white people gather in response to that question about why can't white people gather in affinity groups the same way. So that's an example that came to mind.
So this is a question that I think is very related to what Julie was just talking about. May require you to sort of step outside your perspective. Diane, you may even want to weigh in on this one. How do we as educators of color call out white supremacy as a classroom workplace while balancing the trauma that we've experienced as people? So there's also a related question from a teacher who asked how to address white students when they're concerned that their teacher is racist against white people because anti-racist curriculum is being taught. Difficult questions. So how do we as educators of color call out white supremacy in a classroom or workplace while balancing the trauma that we've experienced as people?
Well, I think it must be very, very difficult, and hopefully, you know, you would have the support of, you know, the administrators, the principals, and you know, the senior people on the staff. I mean, I think, you know, it can feel very lonely, you know, to fight this battle as a person of color, to be placed in that role, and to you know, to feel like you might be you know, diminished or, you know, disregarded for being overly sensitive, or you know, just, you know, taking things the wrong way. So I think there has to be support from the district. It's very hard to do this if you feel like no one has your back. You know, if you're one of the only ones that's going to be taking a stand. And you know, I think there has to be very clear policies in place that, you know, are explicitly stated and visible to everyone, that, you know, you're not tolerant of any kind of discrimination, sexism, racism, etc.
Yeah, it comes back to also Donald's comment that we need to work harder on training teachers of color, especially men, so that children, teenagers, young adults have more models. Julie, what did you want to say?
There are two things here. One is how traumatic it can be for a teacher of color to have to deal with these tough things, these tough concepts and issues that arise in teaching children. And this is where our own finding community and solidarity with people who get it, who don't question, oh, don't take it so personally, or, oh, give them the benefit of the doubt, or, oh, get over it, right? We don't want to talk to those people. You want to process it after the fact with people who get it, who've been there. And that's your family, that's your friend group, that's your chosen family, you know, your sorors, whomever, people at church, wherever you can find community with people who get what you're going through, go there. That is part of your nourishment. you're strengthening. Okay. The second issue is this: you're anti-white because you dare to call out, white supremacy. Look, let us be clear. This is basically the same argument as there are good people on both sides. Donald Trump, right? Or reverse racism. Now white people are being harmed. You need, at a district level, at a state level, you need senior leadership saying, this is the deal. It should not be left to individual teachers and individual classrooms to have to defend why an anti-racist curriculum is not racist against white people. We need leadership on this. We need language based on research and history and sociology and philosophy, right? This work is out there. Let's distribute it and disseminate it. Let's teach all teachers how to respond to this absurd notion that white people are being discriminated against because other people are being treated more equally. There's a beautiful quote that says, "For those who have always enjoyed privilege, equality feels like oppression." They feel they're being oppressed now because all of a sudden they're not at the front of the line all the time anymore. We've got to call this out for what it is and help white children understand this isn't about diminishing you. This is about reversing centuries of practices and mindsets that have been explicitly about keeping others down.
And just to piggyback briefly on what one of the things that Julie said, there's been a lot of diversity councils and task forces that have been springing up, and when it comes to to leadership around these issues, I think the problem is that you have to have very clear goals. Has to be explicitly stated what you're trying to accomplish, and then whoever is on these councils, they have to have some authority to make change. We have task forces, but there's no task, and there's no force behind them. So it has to be very clear what the goal is, and it has to come from higher up. Like this is what we believe in. This is what we stand for, and it's not just going to be a panel of people that's not fully representative of the spectrum of viewpoints, that's making recommendations that have no punch.
I think, some of our questions were around institutional change that we can make both at the classroom level, the district level, the school level, but I think that we probably can't speak to that directly ourselves, but I did love this question. Why is it that people teach gender as a construct, but not race? I think, Julie, you kind of alluded to this. It's a change in mindset that we're all having to make, right? About actively teaching anti-racism is not the same as saying we are oppressing white students. Okay, here's a question that I think that you probably have experience with and both can speak to. I teach students who are working on their social skills, and they don't always realize that their words and actions impact others. If they realize that a microaggression has been made, how can we help them rehabilitate these comments and communicate and these communication breakdowns? So essentially, how can we help kids recognize that their words matter, and how can we rehabilitate kids who may have used language that can be hurtful to others? Any suggestions on that?
We're really, we've lost Donald, and Donald
we've lost him, sorry.
Is an educator on the panel. So this is why you're hearing, at least I'll own that for me. I'm sort of pausing going, oh, I wish Donald was here, because I know what I think and I got a lot of opinions. Y'all know that, but I don't have this is grounded in research and this is what y'all should do. I was just stalling for time, Kareem, so you could answer the question. I do have some thoughts, but do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I don't feel like this is within my wheelhouse, so to speak. I think it's more for me to defer here.
Yeah. I'm just going to locate my answer in this space of kind and compassionate human interaction. We're all imperfect. Everyone makes mistakes. You want to help a kid understand that it's not that they were bad, but that what they said, regardless of what they intended, might have had a harmful impact on others. So it's separating the intention from the outcome. You know, even though you didn't intend it, the outcome does matter. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that somebody was upset or hurt or is now angry, and that is, it's important to resolve that. And here's how we do it. We ask the person to share what it was like for them. You listen, you teach active listening to kids. How do you listen in a way that helps the other person feel that they've been heard? You practice active listening, and that's an act of compassion. That person hopefully feels they got to say what they needed to say. This person then needs to be taught to, after active listening, to say what is on their heart and in their mind, what they intended and how badly they feel, and ultimately that they're sorry. So it's careful mentoring of children through difficult conversations, which, by the way, are not limited to race. And let me put my other hat on, my how to raise an adult hat on, the anti-helicopter parenting hat. Too often, we grown-ups are sorting out these problems for children instead of making the children sort it out with themselves. So books well beyond mind are being written about how we have undermined the ability of young adults to sort out run-of-the-mill conflicts because we showed up in the schoolyard, in the classroom, in the family room, and we adults told them what to say, how to say it. Maybe we adults negotiated with each other instead of making the kids do it. They have not learned how to have difficult conversations and how to work things out with each other, and we have deprived them of that. So we can be there to guide and make suggestions, but the kids have to walk this pathway themselves.
And they're much more capable than we give them credit for. You know, I started my career teaching very young children, and I mean, really a long time ago, and we introduced social problem solving. And that's kind of a fancy term, which means helping kids learn how to, as Julie just said, how to solve their own problems. And we would do that with 4-year-olds. We, as the educator, would stand between two young children and say, it sounds like he's saying this. It sounds like she's saying this. How do you two think you can resolve this? Now, we may not have come as teachers, we may not have come to the same resolution, but the students need a chance to be able to do that. Julie recently interviewed 4 or 5 young people who are local students. Julie, could you just, it may be hard to summarize in a sentence or two, but what did you feel that you were hearing from today's youth? And these were mostly high school students. They had some really powerful perspectives around talking about race in the community.
It was 3 Black high schoolers and 1 Indian high schooler. The Indian woman is at Castellea, and she has created a group, a nonprofit called Real Talk, which is trying to teach, you know, it's high schoolers in a club who are focused on how to have difficult conversations with folks with whom you don't agree or share the same political perspective. So that's what she had going on. The Black kids who are also involved in nonprofits, they're all activists. But what I took most from them were their personal stories about racist teachers in the Palo Alto Unified School District. And it was heartbreaking. Teachers who use the N-word, teachers who openly disdain Black and brown children. They told that truth, and there were school board members listening, there were teachers listening. Adults were having their hearts broken left and right in that conversation, and those young people were so courageous and brave. And it was just a privilege to get to be next to them as they were sharing their truth on the screen.
It was really powerful. And, you know, Kareem, I have been wanting to ask, and I think that our viewers would be interested as well. In your op-ed, which I really recommend people read, White Parents Talk to Your Kids About Race, what is it? You have described yourself as a private person. What is it that brought you to the moment where you really felt that I need to share this now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the brutal murder of George Floyd really sparked something in many people, including myself. But this is, you know, after a series of other just horrific incidents of, you know, innocent, you know, Black people being murdered either at the hands of law enforcement or, you know, civilians. You know, and I think we had seen this play out, you know, in the past, you know, many times before. And for me, it just sort of kind of boiled over. I mean, we think about, you know, You know, Tamir Rice, for example, who, you know, were he alive today, he'd be voting, he could be voting in his first presidential election this fall. You know, Trayvon Martin would have been 25, you know, just this past summer. And so, you know, all of it just built up in me and it left me feeling quite raw, as I'm sure was the case for many people. And so I just wanted to, you know, put, you know, pen to paper, so to speak, and just give my perspective on kind of one piece of this puzzle that I think I felt I had a little bit of insight into. I mean, I think that was the inspiration for the piece. But you know, this is work that, you know, racism, it permeates everything, you know, in our lives, in our society, in ways that we see visibly, but also in unseen ways. And so, you know, I felt like if I could add something to the conversation that might resonate, that might be helpful, then I was more than happy to do that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I remember it being so powerful when President Barack Obama came on and said, you know, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. And that was such a personal, at least for me as a parent, I felt it. I felt his pain and what that must have seemed like. So before we go to our final question, we have just a few minutes. This is a question that keeps coming up. It may not be exactly in your wheelhouse as classroom, non-classroom educators, Julie and Kareem, but let's see what your thoughts are. Do you have any thoughts about things we should take into consideration when teaching about white privilege and systemic racism to diverse groups of students? What should we take into consideration when teaching about white privilege and systemic racism?
I think the most important thing probably is that these are societal forces and historic forces that show up very much in today's structures and laws and regulations and behaviors. But this isn't about blaming any individual person or class of people outright. I think for a young white kid today, I imagine they're looking around, they're hearing this stuff, and they're like hearing for the first time, white people are bad, white people are violent, white people are mean, white police officers are bad. You know, they're starting to feel something's wrong with my group the way kids of color have always been made to feel. That's not good for anybody. We don't want this to be about guilting and shaming. I mean, it's important for this country to have a truth and reconciliation around who we are and why we are this way. But, you know, that's not the work the children have to do right away. What they need to know is there's a problem. It's been around for a long time. We can do something about it. You know, the positivity, okay? We are going to be the generation that treats everybody with dignity, and respect. You know, it's what can we do instead of what shouldn't we do. It's how can we be good? This is ultimately about character. How can we be of good character, you know, as opposed to, you know, these folks who are of bad character because they don't treat everybody with dignity and respect. So I think that's the, you know, that's the positive spin on this. It's this terrible, awful thing, yes. But we, as individual actors, have the power in every interaction, in every decision we make, every choice, every way we solve problems. We can choose to do it in a way that is anti-racist and that values all.
Thank you, Julie. That gets back to our conversation today that we've been having about intentionality. Even though it may not be perfect, it's important to have these conversations in the classroom with our students, with our colleagues, in a school, and in our leadership positions.
Yeah, I'd just like to add quickly that I agree with the notion of appealing to people's better nature. You know, I mean, people, I think, want to do good, and we should emphasize that. And, you know, I think I had another thought, but then I lost the thread. Sorry. Yeah, you know, we're not about blaming people or making people feel bad. This is about uplifting everyone, and you know, you're not going to lose anything by participating in this fight. It's going to lift everyone up, and to view it as a lifelong process, a learning process, a growth process. That there's going to be bumps along the way, but this is one of the major challenges of our time. And you know, we're developing the tools to meet it and to conquer it.
I want to offer one final story. It comes from my mother, who's an 81-year-old educator. She's a white British lady. She has her PhD in science education and has been on the faculty at Columbia and at Stanford schools of education. And my mother's a math and science person, mostly science. And it is her passion to try to ensure that all children learn. And often she was given the problem kids, the kids who couldn't learn, the kids everyone else had given up on. Oh, by the way, Black and brown kids. And if she was here right now, I'm channeling her as I try to tell this story quickly. She was working at Summit High School in Redwood City. There was this Latino male named Luis. And Luis's approach at this point to science was like, you know, Luis had it with school. Why? Probably because Luis had been taught over the years that Luis didn't matter. And my mother was determined to crack through Luis's facade that he was putting up and demonstrate that she cared about him. And so she had this really complex problem, and she brought it over to his workshop table and said, here, you know, I want you guys to work on this. And Luis was like, you know, and had an attitude and wouldn't engage. And she went up to him and she said, Luis, my job is to teach you and to try to help you learn. And I believe in you and I know you can do this. And I'm sorry that you're not giving me the opportunity to succeed as a teacher. And she walked away. And Luis followed her. And I'm sure I'm not getting all the language right, but somehow she had reframed it as like, it is my job to help you make this stuff happen, and you're not even gonna try. There was somehow a reframing in that made him feel like this lady actually does care about me, I think. You know, it wasn't actually about my mom. She wasn't trying to say like, you gotta be successful for me. She was trying to demonstrate an ethic of deep care about his learning that somehow got through to him. And that kid turned it on, became the guy, right? They were able to do a lot of work at Summit around reducing the achievement gap significantly through demonstrating to all children that, you know, I am here for you. I care about you. Let's do this.
We know the storytelling is really powerful. And so before we hand it back to Principal Burbank, just a couple seconds, you guys, if you would, tell us what gives you hope for the future, Kareem and Julie. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, events like these, you know, give me hope that there's so much enthusiasm and passion and humility that people are bringing to these discussions. I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing, you know, people come together in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And I mean, you look across the country where, you know, protests are happening, you know, in support of, you know, Black Lives Matter, and these are happening in, you know, in New York and Boston, but also in, you know, rural Idaho and Montana. I mean, it's really quite striking to see, and I'm hopeful that, you know, we will keep our foot on the gas, that you know, that this will be the spark for real and lasting change, because this is very hard work, and it's going to take a long time to get it right, to get all the stakeholders on board, and to get, you know, get things moving in the right direction for the long haul. But you know, I think, you know, there's a lot of things that we can take solace in spite of all the challenges of COVID, and of course, you know, racism and white supremacy are still, you know, major issues. But you know, I think you know, the fact that we can come here today, I mean, it would have been inconceivable to have, you know, I mean, there's so many other forums where these kinds of conversations are happening as well. So I'm really encouraged by that.
Thank you, Kareem. Julie, quickly, last thought. What gives you hope?
Well, I don't know if it's quick, so bear with me, folks. Here's what I want to say. We haven't talked much about class, and class and race are very closely tied, and of course, very different things as well. What gives me hope are the great ideas I'm hearing about how to really disrupt education in the time of COVID. I heard this phenomenal idea just the other day. Why are we having every algebra teacher teach algebra, every science teacher teach centripetal force, every English teacher teach a certain novel? Why not have one teacher in the district or the entire state you know, be on the video, create the content, and have every single other teacher of that discipline be there to assist students one-on-one and in small groups with the learning that is so challenging at a distance level. That is a disruptive idea that I think is frankly brilliant. It's a complete reallocation of the resource of teachers and teaching in service of what kids need in this climate, particularly poor kids, particularly kids of color who aren't likely to have the devices, aren't likely to have the Wi-Fi, aren't likely to have, you know, all of the fancy supports, certainly the pandemic pods that the wealthy families are creating. You know, let's redistribute the resource of teachers more effectively so that every child can be held, seen, and heard through this distance learning until we can all get back in the classroom together. That's an idea that excites me.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you, Kareem. Thank you, Donald, wherever you are. Sorry we lost you. Bev, if you would put that final slide up on the screen for teachers to log their attendance. And Diane, I'm going to give it back to you for final words.
Absolutely. Thank you for the district for organizing this. Thank you to Charlene and to Bev and to Julie, Kareem, and Donald for creating a safe space. I will share with my principal colleagues in the district the 70-minute mark where there was talk about how teachers feel attacked when they're trying to bring equity of voice and talk about social justice in the classrooms. You have my commitment that I will support teachers at Woodside, and I will share the comments and the responses from our panelists at that 70-minute mark. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. Go home and talk to your kids, talk to your colleagues. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you all. Be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.